Hi, I'm Ryan Velez. I'm going to teach you today about moving the same piece twice in chess games and looking at when that's okay to do and when that's not okay to do. Generally speaking, you don't want to do that in the beginning of a chess game, but we're going to look at some times when it is acceptable because it's a kind of a confusing rule for many people. So anyway, moving the same piece too many times in the opening means you're wasting time. Wasting time in chess means you are not attacking the middle, castling, developing your pieces towards the center, and other useful types of things. Wasting time also means that you don't have any plans, and your opponent, whether or not they have a plan, you clearly don't know what it is. Because if you knew what it was, you would try to stop it. In the opening, moving the same piece many times usually refers to queens, knights, bishops, and pawns specifically. If you're moving the king and the rooks multiple times, you're breaking different opening principles. So you definitely want to make sure that you're not moving your king out really early in the game or bringing your rooks out because they're worth too much and bishops can just take them. So anyway, let's start with the queen. In this example, Black moves their queen 5 times out of 10 moves. So that's 50% of their moves. So let's look at that example here. So here, the queen has moved into the middle of the board. She's attacked, and then she moves to the side of the board. This is actually a normal opening called the Scandinavian Defense. Right now, it's really difficult to attack this queen with in any sort of reasonable way. So Black has done nothing wrong yet. So White brings both of their knights out. They have 2 knights developed. Black has 1 queen developed. And then we have this bishop move here, attacking the knight. So far, nobody's made any big, horrible mistakes or anything like that. So here, this bishop came out and moved a second time to capture the knight. That's okay. Whenever you move a piece a second time for a capture, provided that the capture is fair, and here it's a 3-point knight for a 3-point bishop, so that's fair. Generally okay. So that's not a big deal. And here we have recaptured with the queen, and you see that red arrow is showing that the queen is attacking the b7 pawn. And if Black isn't careful, White will take there and then also take the rook in the corner. So Black has to deal with that problem. So in this game, Black played knight c6, kind of blocking the queen's ability to see the b7 pawn. So that's good for Black. And now we have a simple threat. The idea is if Black, let's say Black doesn't do anything useful, maybe they just go here. This isn't a good move. But the threat is White can take, we can take here, and then we can take back. And now we have a threat on the king and the rook, and the king will have to move here, and then we'll lose the rook. And so you can see the queen just moved several times. She went from f3 to c6 to a8. So that's 3 times. But in 2 of those times, the queen won pieces. So she won a pawn on the c6 square, and she won a rook on the a8 square. So those are good reasons to move a queen multiple times. Okay, but let's go back. So let's assume that Black noticed that, and they're like, oh, I can't let that happen. So they play queen to b6. So now these green arrows indicate that the queen, the Black queen, has moved 3 times. So now we're starting to get into a situation where the Black queen is probably moving too many times. And I mean, it was kind of necessary to do, but at the same time, this is how you get in trouble. When you move the same piece too many times, you start having problems. So watch what happens. Actually, let's see here. We also have this idea. So what if we played a6 instead? This is another mistake move, but I'm going to show you one more example. So the queen has the same attack as we saw before. Queen takes the rook this time, but this time the queen takes the bishop as well and is also looking at this g7 square. If she can take the pawn on g7, she will probably also take the rook on h8. So again, in this situation, the queen has moved 4 times. She went 1, 2, 3, 4, with 2 more potential moves. So again, these are examples of a piece moving multiple times that's good, because the queen is winning a lot of pieces from black, because black didn't defend their position very well. And black bringing their queen out early and not kind of paying attention to the threats caused problems. So that's another example of when moving the queen multiple times would be helpful in the opening. But anyway, okay, so now we can go back. We can go to our queen b6 move. And now we're looking at knight d5, which is a sneaky move. So you can see the 2 green arrows show that the white knight has moved twice. And it's making, and the red arrows show the 2 threats that it's making. The first threat is if it attacks, it's just attacking the queen and can take the queen. The second threat is that it can potentially take the c7 pawn and attack the king and the rook at the same time. When one piece attacks 2 pieces, that's called a fork. And usually knights are the best piece for making forks in chess. So black has 2 main responses here. The first one is, what happens if they just take this bishop? Because before that knight move, the knight was actually guarding the bishop, as you can see. But once he moves, he's no longer guarding that bishop. So the first response is, all right, what happens if we just take the bishop? Well, that fork comes into play. You'll notice that the knight is still attacking the rook as well as the king, but this time, since the queen is worth more points, we wouldn't take the rook, we would take the queen. That's why the red arrow is pointing at the queen instead of the rook. So, you know, it would look like this. So in addition to that, black can no longer castle their king, and this red arrow indicates that white can actually threaten to take another pawn in a moment if black isn't careful. So that would be a big mistake if black were to take the bishop. So black is not going to take the bishop, and instead they're going to play a5, continuing to guard the c7 square from the knight. Okay, so this move happens, and it's the move b4, and it's very good because now the queen is trapped. No matter what happens, she's in trouble. She cannot move to any of these green squares because something guards those squares. So for example, I'll use red arrows for this. I'm going to get rid of that one. So the knight guards the b4 pawn and the b6 square. The bishop guards the a6 square and the a4 square. And this bishop guards the a3 square. So the only move that's left, because the pawn on b4 attacks the queen as well, so the only move that's left is to actually take the bishop, which, as we've already learned in a couple of examples, loses the queen to this fork. So again, moving the same piece multiple times in an opening is sometimes acceptable to do. Other times it's not. You have to get a feel and an understanding for when it's okay to do. So I'm trying to give you those examples. So like if you're taking lots of free pieces, or you're making checkmate or checkmate threats, those are good reasons. Or if your piece is attacked by a pawn or something, those are good reasons to move it again. But bringing one piece out and not doing anything else and making no threats like the black queen did in this game, that's not a good way to play chess. Okay, so let's move on to moving the knight too much. Again, it's the same problem as moving the queen too much, but you know, we look at each piece just to see how things can go wrong. So here's a common way to start out a chess game. The knight comes out attacking the pawn moves forward and attacks, and then the knight moves again. I've probably won 1,000 chess games on the internet because people did this exact move against me. And I'll show you how to deal with it. The correct move is actually to move your knight here. And a lot of times this pawn will come out attacking the knight. You can run away, and then this pawn goes here. And the idea is, yes, the black knight has moved 3 times. However, these pawns are now going to become targets of attack. You'll notice that the knight is already watching one. It's defended by the bishop, but just watching it's important. So this knight move, while it didn't take anything or make big threats, it's been proven for over years that these 3 knight moves are okay to play. So that's an example of a way when you can move a knight multiple times and it's okay. But let's look at when it's bad. So when the knight moves to e4 right here, this causes other problems for white. So white plays d3, attacking the knight. So the knight has to move again. You'll notice that white also freed their dark square bishop. So most of the time in this position, they move their knight to c5. And then you can play d4 again. So now we've moved this pawn 2 times, but both times it threatened the knight with an attack. So that means that those pawn moves are okay. Now these 2 green arrows represent 2 different moves that the knight can go. If he moves to the a6 square, he's on the edge of the board. That's not very good. He's only got 4 places he can see, and he can only move to 2 of them. The 2 red circles, he can only move to those 2. So this is not a very good place for your knight. But unfortunately, it would have been better than what happened in this game. Knight to e4 is not so good because now the knight is kind of stuck. So white plays f3, and all of these green circles show where the knight can move, but unfortunately, there is a piece or pawn that is attacking all of those squares, as you can see. And then, of course, this bishop attacks that one all the way over there. So no matter where the knight goes, it's going to get captured. So in this game, a lot of times when I show it, people ask 2 questions. They say, what happens if I guard the knight, and what happens if I play the knight to f2? So let's do the guard the knight move first. So d5, we're guarding the knight. Unfortunately, the pawn will just take, black will take back, and now white has captured 3 points worth of pieces in exchange for 1 pawn. So that means white is winning now. And it's probably going to happen that this pawn is going to get captured as well. A simple move, like knight to here, just threatens to attack it, and that pawn becomes more and more difficult to guard over time. So if you just guard the knight, you lose a piece. Now we go back and we look at what happens if knight to f2. Well, knight to f2, the king can take it, but we have to take this move very seriously because the knight is making a fork. Remember, 1 piece attacking 2 pieces. So if we don't take the knight, then we're going to lose our queen or rook. So the king captures, and yes, it's true, the king can no longer castle. However, there is a special way that we can castle, which Coach Daniel Brennan covered in the castling video last week before we made this video. I'll show you what happens. You do this thing called castling by hand. It means that you're castling your king by making multiple moves instead of 1 castling move. So we just cleared out both of the pieces that were between the king and the rook. So next, black castles in 1 move. White puts their rook on f1, which is where they would have castled. He could have moved it to e1 as well. That would have been fine. c5, and then king g1. So you see the king kind of moved to f2 and then to g1. So it kind of looks like we castled. Castling by hand just means you move the rook to f1 and the king to g1 independently instead of all in 1 move, like black does on their 8th move when they castle. So, okay. So that's an example of moving the knight too many times. Often because the knight doesn't have a lot of squares it can move to begin with, he gets trapped really quickly. So you got to be very careful moving your knight too many times. Now we're going to look at the bishop. This one's a little more involved. But the bishop in this game moves 3 times in a row, and all 3 times, 2 of the 3 times it was actually okay to move, but unfortunately the combination of the 3 moves ends up meaning that black loses a bishop. So let's look at how that works. Okay, so we're also going to look at a couple of other positive examples. So like, again, once again, right here, bishop moves out once and then a second time to capture a piece. This is okay because not only the bishop did move 2 times, but it captures the knight it captures the knight by moving a second time because that was black's only developed piece. So it's okay. Again, learning the situations where it's okay to move a piece more than one time is important, just as much as it's important to understand that moving them multiple times is often bad if you're not careful. So black takes back because that's a good idea. Castling, getting your king safe. Bishop g4. So this is the first time that this bishop moves. This is the bishop we're going to watch in our example. He actually moves 4 times in this game, but this move is okay. This is not a bad move. h3 attacks the bishop. So the bishop runs away. That was a good retreat. Although, as you'll see, capturing that knight right here, this would have been a better way for white or for black to play in this game than what happened. So moving it out and then capturing a developed piece would have been better. But let's watch what happens when the retreat occurs. So then white plays g4, attacking the bishop. Well, the bishop can't stay there. So again, this retreat by the bishop makes a lot of sense. It's a good move because you don't want to lose your bishop for free. However, the next move, the bishop captures here. So we basically have the bishop going 1, 2, 3, 4. He moves 4 times, and a couple of those moves made a lot of sense, but really he should have just taken the knight on f3. So now what has happened is he has opened this file, because basically what happened was white captured a pawn for free, and if black doesn't do something, then black will be down a pawn. So black kind of panicked a little bit and said, ha, I'm going to take that pawn. And this is where they got into trouble. They're relying on one piece to do too many things. So the rook goes to e1, and you'll notice that it's attacking the bishop, and it's lined up with the enemy king. And if the bishop moves out of the way, which is a very bad move, white has 2 good moves. One of them is much better than the other one, but they're still both good. The first move is here. We attack the queen and the king at the same time. When you have a rook like this right here, when you have a rook who is lined up with a king and there's a piece in between them, moving that piece that's in between can create what's called discovered check or a discovered attack. In this case, it's discovered check because we're attacking the king. So the knight moves out of the way, attacking the queen, and because black has to get out of check, we're going to be able to take that queen. There's also this idea. You could get out of check by using the queen, but the knight could still take. So it doesn't matter which way, or however black wants to get out of check, they're going to lose their queen. The other good move is knight takes bishop. So then if you get out of check by blocking it, we can take this rook. This isn't as good because we're not winning the queen, but we still want a bishop and a rook. That's 8 points. That's pretty close to the same thing as winning a queen. So anyway, we'll go back and we understand that after rook e1, black really can't move their bishop again, because if they did, it would be even worse than what happens in the game. So black moves their bishop or their queen to attack the knight where the red arrow is and guard the bishop. But then everything falls apart. This knight move is really good. It attacks both the queen and the bishop. As we learned, that's called a fork, when one piece attacks 2. And so here, obviously, the queen is the most valuable piece, so we're going to move it. The best move for the queen is probably just to retreat, but unfortunately, she took this knight, and then the rook captures, and now the queen is pinned to the king. A pin is when, if you try to move the queen out of the way, you can see that the rook would be able to see the king, and it would be check. And since in chess we're not allowed to put ourselves in check, we cannot move the queen out of the way of the rook. We can only go up and down with the queen. So the queen will take the rook because that's at least getting 5 points, and the knight takes back, and now white is winning the game. I will also point out that this rook has moved 3 times in the game. So let's look at those 3 times real quick, just so that we understand what's going on. The first time was when it castled. This was its first move. The second time was after the bishop captured, we moved the rook to this open file. And again, because we're making a threat against that bishop and possibly threats against the king, this second rook move is okay. And finally, once we capture the bishop, we pin the queen. Well, first of all, we capture a bishop. That's good. And secondly, we pin the queen to the king, and then we win the queen for a rook. Rook is worth 5 points and the queen is worth 9. So that's really good for white. So in the end, this is a good example of what happens when you move a bishop too many times. It's bad to do that, especially if your bishop's not really making threats or capturing much or doing much of anything. Whereas here we see a good example of moving the same piece multiple times where the rook moved 3 times and all 3 times it made sense. Even this knight right here moved 2 times. He moved here and then there. And that was great because he was capturing something on that second move. Okay, the last thing to cover is when pawns move, when you move too many pawns. That's still kind of the same thing as don't move the same piece twice. It's very difficult to move the same pawn many, many times in a row. I will give an example of that in a moment. But we also have to consider don't move too many pawns at the same time. So let's look at a quick game real quick for why that is not so good. So right here, so far everybody's moved a normal amount of pawns. No big mistakes have occurred yet. And that bishop just moved 2 times, but then it captured a piece. And this knight moved 2 times, but it recaptured a piece. So both of those are acceptable moments to move the same piece multiple times. So this pawn has just moved 2 times, and that's okay because he captured another pawn. So this knight has now moved twice, but again, it's okay because he recaptured something. This knight, same thing, he moved twice and recaptured. And then once again, this bishop has moved twice and recaptured. So as you can see, recapturing makes a lot of sense to move a piece multiple times. That's okay. So f6, here's another pawn move for black. Notice that white has only moved 2 pawns, this e4 pawn and the d pawn that moved, but it's now gone. So we've only moved 2 pawns. Black, however, has moved this pawn, the f6 pawn, the d6 pawn, and the e pawn, which moved up to here but is now gone. And he moved that e pawn a second time. So technically, black has made 4 pawn moves. So here we go. That's a 5th pawn move. Here's a 6th pawn move. You'll see that white is developing new pieces as much as they can, and black is just moving pawns. 7th pawn move for black. 8th pawn move for black. That's a 9th pawn move for black. So you'll see that white is castled. They've got their rook towards the middle. They've got the queen in a good spot. They've got 2 bishops developed. Black basically has a bunch of pawns moved and a knight blocking the bishop and the queen a little bit. And it's blocking the king from being able to castle. So, because you can't, he didn't move that knight into a really good spot. So, white moves a 3rd pawn finally by capturing in the middle. Black captures with a knight. And then white threatens the rook in the corner. And you can see how powerful these bishops are. And the reason they're so powerful is because all of these pawns moved out of the way. And so if those pawns were all back a little bit, there'd be no threats here. This would be a different game completely. So the knight captures the pawn on f4, moving a 3rd time. 1, 2, 3. So again, capturing the pawn is probably fine, except for the fact that moving so many pawns has made the king very weak, and it's made this rook very weak, that capturing that pawn was not a good enough move to prevent white from being able to win the game at this point. So watch what happens. The queen goes to e3. She's attacking the knight and the king. That's a fork, as we've learned. And the bishop on d4 is still attacking this rook on h8. So there is no possible way that black can guard all of this with one move, so they're going to lose pieces. So they get out of check this way. And then white captures the black rook on h8. And you'll notice this red arrow, we talked about discovered attacks and discovered checks. Once that bishop moves right here, once he moves out of the way, the black queen is under attack from the rook on d1. So we capture. Once again, black doesn't see the threat and captures a pawn attacking the queen, but unfortunately, white captures the queen with check. So black cannot take the white queen because they're in check. So they got to get out of check first, and then the queen moves up to here. The knight moves again to the edge. So as you can see, once black stopped moving a bunch of pawns, he started moving this knight a whole lot, and that's not all that helpful. That's bad too, because the knight's capturing pawns when he has rooks under attack, and he's capturing pawns when the king and queen are under attack. This is not a good way to move the same piece multiple times. So we move this rook. Now the knight moves in one final time, getting a fork, and in most situations, this fork would be fantastic, but unfortunately here, white checkmates the black king. You can see the green circles are where the black king could try to move, but the red arrows show where the queen is watching. She's watching all of the squares the king is on or could move to, and if the king tried to take the queen, you'll see the green arrow, the rook is defending the queen. So this is checkmate and the game is over and black has lost. So our final, oh, actually there was one thing I wanted to show you before I move on. There is a way that you can move pawns multiple times that's bad. I told you generally because pawns get stuck, you can't really move them multiple times that often, but here's the most common way I see people move pawns multiple times. They'll move a pawn one square, and then on the very next move or very soon after, they move it a second time. Why do that when on the first move, you could just play e4 instead? You know, and the same is true for pretty much all the, you know, the D pawn or the C pawn. Those are good pawn moves to move at the beginning. So moving them one square is usually not all that helpful. It's better just to move them two. Okay, so we'll go on to our final example. Here is an example of good play from both sides where both sides have a couple of pieces that move more than one time, but you can see why it's okay. So here we go. Okay. So here we move a pawn one square, like I just said not to do, but you'll notice that here we're not blocking in the bishop. Our bishop is already outside, so this is okay. And the pawn has a very good reason to do it. This knight is attacking the pawn, and so we go there and defend it. So that's okay. So here we go. Now this bishop just moved a second time. The reason is because it doesn't want to get caught when this knight moves to the edge, attacking here and here, because then the bishop will have a hard time retreating in some variations. So basically he's retreating back so that he can be tucked away this way and attack this way later on in the game. So that's why that bishop's moving there. So this is okay. This is a very common move. So both sides castle, knight b to d2, rook e8, rook e1. You'll notice that both sides are not really moving the same piece that many times. And both sides have a lot of pieces moved out attacking the middle. So both sides are doing really great here. Now, the white bishop moves a third time because it has moved 1, 2, and then the green arrow is the third move. Again, this third move, it's capturing a bishop. It's worth the same amount. This is okay. So here, the rook has moved twice. This is okay. He recaptured on e6. There's nothing wrong with that move. So knight f1, as you can see, this knight has moved 2 times. But again, the idea is to move the knight over to the g3 square right here where this circle is flashing. And then from there, we can go over to f5 and try to attack the king by attacking squares near the king. So sometimes you have to move a piece multiple times to get it to a really good spot. As long as you're not allowing your opponent to attack you or you're not losing pieces, this is okay to do. So the rook retreats because leaving the rook on e6 is probably not that great. So he runs away. That's fine. The knight goes to g3 like we talked about. The queen on d7. The knight has moved to f5. So this knight has moved 1, 2, 3, 4 times. But you'll notice that during those 4 moves, white never lost a pawn. He never lost a piece. He didn't get checkmated. He didn't lose a rook. Everything is okay. So you can move the same piece many times as long as your opponent can't hurt your position. So here we go. Rook a to d8. You'll notice now that black has moved every piece they own at least once. I'm not talking about pawns. I'm just talking about pieces. The light square bishop moved out and captured. And then you've got all of these pieces have moved at least once. So once you move all your pieces once, obviously you're going to have to move them at least a second or third or fourth time at some point. So just understand that moving the same piece twice rule is mostly about the beginning of the chess game, not so much later on in the game. So here we go. This pawn moved once and now twice. That pawn moved twice. It's because he moved up to his original square and captured, but he's capturing a pawn for a pawn. That's okay. The C pawn moved up and then captured. And again, it's recapturing a pawn is just fine. And as you can see, since the pawn is threatening the bishop runs away. So that's the bishop's second time moving, but that's okay because the bishop wanted to get to a safe spot. So this is a good way to play. So from here, black will probably just bring, you know, they can, or white, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say black. White can, you know, go here and defend this pawn, and the game can just kind of proceed from here. And at this point, neither side's really in the opening anymore. So anyway, I hope that you've learned a little bit about when you should and should not move the same piece twice in the opening. And I hope you understand that this rule is usually talking about pawns, queens, bishops, and knights, not so much the king or the rook. Those are different problems, and we'll cover those in a different video. All right, I hope you learned a lot, and have a good day.